About your recent study. What was the hypothesis that you and your colleagues were going on? What did you want to find out?
Well, we had already known from background research that children who were exposed to violent crime nearby, so crime in their kind of local block, perform worse on tests. And so we were really curious about what were the mechanisms, why, how did that violence that they're exposed to get under the skin into the brain to affect performance. And so our hypothesis was that there was two different systems that might be at play. There's of course many other ways that it could affect kids, but we were really interested in whether or not violent crime affected sleep, because sleep is really important for levels of energy, for levels of fatigue, obviously, but also for cognitive performance. So we thought perhaps the violent crime was affecting children's sleep, which in turn maybe affected performance. But also, we've done a lot of research on a biological stress system called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which has its primary hormone is called cortisol. And so we were interested also whether violent crime affected cortisol levels in children and adolescents, because as you might guess, cortisol is also important for cognitive functioning.
Tell me a little bit about the study, how many children were involved and how you went about looking at those cortisol and stress levels.
Well, we looked at 82 children aged 11 through 18, and they were from a large Midwestern city. And we actually got them from the public school system, and they met with us on a Saturday, and we measured all sorts of things with them. And then we sent them home with sleep watches that are called ActiWatches, that are objective wrist-based monitors that measure activity level, but from those activity levels you can measure sleep. There's a lot of consumer devices on the market now for people, but we had fancy research devices for them to use. So we had objective measures of sleep using actigraphy. And then we also sent them home with saliva sampling kits. Basically, we asked them to spit for us 3 times a day for 3 days, and from that saliva we can measure levels of the stress hormone cortisol. And so they did that for 3 days, and there were many other purposes to the study, and it was kind of an aha moment when we said, we should find out what's going on in the kids' neighborhoods on the days that they're doing this testing, not just because we'd been asking them about violent crime, but we thought it'd be even better if we'd measured, so they'd self-reported violent crime in diaries and in questionnaires and all sorts of stressors, but we thought, we can get the violent crime information from police records, and so that's what we did in this study. We looked at how police records of violent crime on the very days that they were doing their sleep testing and their cortisol testing were related to sleep and cortisol. And the interesting thing about our method is we're not just comparing kids that live in more violent neighborhoods to kids that live in less violent neighborhoods. We're comparing the same kids on days that they did encounter a violent crime or a violent crime occurred in their block group to those same kids on days when there wasn't a violent crime in their block. So in a sense, it's comparing the kids to themselves and looking at what we call within-person changes in sleep and cortisol, the ups and downs of sleep and cortisol with the ups and downs of violence in their lives.
What did you find?
Well, we first of all found the disturbing fact that 51% of the kids in our study were exposed to a violent crime during the days of testing. And I should clarify, when I say exposed to, we don't know how many of those kids actually witnessed or saw or heard about those crimes. We're measuring, was there a crime in the neighborhood, and how did the kids sleep and cortisol affected? So it's quite likely that some kids did and some kids didn't hear about the crime, but certainly enough kids heard about it that their sleep and their cortisol was affected. What we found is that on the nights that after a violent crime had occurred that day, kids went to, fell asleep later, so their bedtimes were delayed by almost a half hour. And we also found that the next morning, their cortisol levels had a big surge in them compared. So they had everybody usually has a surge in cortisols in the morning. That's something that helps to kind of get you out of bed and get you ready and going for the day. But on days when that are extra challenging, you have a larger surge in cortisol. And we found that kids the day after a violent crime had a significantly larger surge in cortisol, and they didn't have as big a surge on the days that there wasn't a violent crime. The other interesting thing we found is that the more violent the nature of the crime was, the larger the effects. So for kids and I should preface this by saying that the more violent the crimes are, the fewer crimes we're looking at, so the data become kind of shakier in terms of our confidence about the findings. But we found, for example, for homicides, if there was a homicide in the kids block group on the days of testing, and again, there was only 2 homicides that occurred, but for those kids where there was a homicide in their block group, their sleep was delayed by, I think, nearly 2 hours, and yeah, it was 1.8 hours later bedtimes, and overall 1 hour less sleep for those kids that night. So not only was their sleep delayed, it was also less sleep for those kids, which really has strong implications for performance. And also the cortisol responses were also higher for those kids where there was a homicide in their block group.
What are the implications for this study?
Well, obviously the clearest implication is that violence is bad for kids. That's not newsflash, but it tells us a little bit about why and how violence is bad for kids. It's bad for kids in many other ways also, but the fact that it's affecting these biological systems that are affecting kids' brains and affecting kids' cognitive functioning really shows that the implications for potential implications and pathways by which violence affects cognitive performance. These same pathways also affect health outcomes. We didn't assess those in that study, but it raises concerns about the possible health outcomes of violence for kids as well. And I think the other important things to note is that crime affects not just the direct victims of those crimes, but also nearby residents, and in particular in this study, adolescents in the neighborhood. So we consider, in terms of thinking about what people can do about this, we had a number of suggestions. One is that parents should strive, if possible, to protect their kids from hearing about crime. So although it might be tempting to make note or talk to your family about what's going on, it certainly for safety purposes, it's important to have safety rules in place in terms of when you go out at night, etc. But protecting kids from the information about those violent crimes might be helpful. That's not something we tested in this study, but it might be helpful. Something we do know from past research is that both the systems, both cortisol and sleep, are strongly influenced by feelings of safety. So if crime is contributing to feelings of danger in these kids, which in turn contributes to worse sleep and stress hormone alterations, anything that'll make them feel safe is going to be a good thing. And parents are the primary number one way to make kids feel safe. So anything parents can do to express their love and support and provide warmth in the home for their children, particularly if there's an upsetting incident that's occurred, that will help kids to buffer kids from the effects of violent crime. So for sleep, for example, again, these are adolescents now, so it's hard to imagine things like a bedtime routine, but routines actually matter still for adolescents. So comfort and warmth and a good, it might be a different bedtime routine than reading the kids a story, but having a regular bedtimes and regular routines helps make kids feel safe and comforted and helps to reduce the effects of violence or should help to reduce the effects of violence on biology.
In terms of policymakers, are there any messages for people who do make policy coming from this?
I think absolutely. One thing that we noted in the study is that the more violent the crime, the more effect it had on children's biology. So anything we can do to decrease the severity and violence of the crimes that occur is going to be important. So one immediately goes to thinking about gun control. A lot of the homicides that occur are by firearms, are by guns, and so stricter gun control rules that get guns and programs to get guns off the streets would go a long way to reducing the level of violence that kids are exposed to. Anything else that can control kind of the level of violent crime would also be important, but certainly gun control comes to mind first. I think policymakers really have to think about anything they can do to increase the safety of neighborhoods, because that safety is, as I said, not just affecting the individuals that are the victims of the crime, but every individual in that neighborhood.
What are some of the next steps for your research?
We're really interested in, this study had, as I kind of mentioned, we had a relatively small sample size. So if we were able to repeat this research with a larger group of kids, and we have a study underway in which we'll be able to do that, we'll have closer to 300 kids in the next study. And with a larger group, we can see whether there's, we can measure more about the factors that might buffer kids, the family factors, the school factors, the neighborhood factors that might buffer or protect kids from the negative impacts of crime. So testing some of those things that I suggested as that parents do, testing them more thoroughly. We can also consider how the effect of violent crime interacts with other stressors in children's lives. And so one thing we weren't able to do is look at effects by level of poverty in children, or by racial, ethnic differences in kids. And a lot of my other research shows strong differences in sleep and cortisol according to minority, race, ethnicity, and ties those findings to effects of discrimination. And so that's perhaps another TV clip for you, but we're interested really in how the stress of violence interacts with the other types of stressors that pile up in adolescents' lives to really have long-term effects on health and well-being and academic performance.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background, where you studied, got your undergraduate, what those studies were in, master's, and your advanced degree?
I did an undergraduate in psychology at the University of Toronto, so I'm Canadian originally. And then I did a master's in applied human development also at the University of Toronto, and then moved to the University of Minnesota for my PhD in child psychology. And then towards the end of my PhD in child psychology, I had gotten very interested in the implications of research on human development for public policy. So I did a master's in public policy at the University of Chicago, which is what brought me to the Windy City. And I've been here ever since, and now in a program that combines human development and social policy.